Hello, my name's Emmanuel Richards. I'm putting together these little sections on stories every week. And I think week 3, we did a section called Anger. Recently, we've had some pretty tragic news here in Melbourne, Australia, where one of our young men from church was murdered. And I feel it's appropriate to touch on that, as it's a timely and I guess it's a very relevant topic at the moment. So as an introduction to today's section, which is part 5, it's going to have a little section on anger, but primarily on forgiveness and the peace that comes through the atonement of Jesus Christ. My understanding, based on experience, is that we as humans love to support and rally behind and back up people we love and cherish and care for or affiliate with. And in that backing up, especially when we are younger, that can result in actions that become regrettable when all the dust settles and we're left with our own thoughts. I shared in that earlier video that, over 25 years ago, could have been considered one of those little individuals who would spark off at not very much at all, who would back up the boys and who would get myself in all sorts of trouble. I remember having an individual approach me who was a friend at that time, many years later, who had, out of the very same type of experience that we're facing now, defended a family member from being harmed to the point where harm was dished out to another. Significant harm. That individual, if you were to look at the outside, fine, protected family. But when you settled, there were no good feelings inside. Inside, he had significantly hurt someone else who he had no affiliation with other than he had hurt family. For those of you who might watch this today, who are sitting there with a vengeful heart based on true tragic events, I invite you to look inside your heart and ask the question, if the natural feelings I have are executed, or in other words, I get revenge, will that bring our brother, our cousin, our son, our friend back? And if we impose revenge and you take away your eternal progression and you live with that, have you considered what that might feel like? Now, I know from experience that I would never have considered that. I would have flown off the handle, imposed whatever justice I felt appropriate, and I wouldn't have cared what tomorrow brought. But I guess I'm not a teenager anymore. 25 years later, I've come to learn that some of the actions that I put in place that hurt others hurt me, hurt my soul. They're embarrassing when I think I imposed so-called justice where someone else has promised us justice is mine, and that's our Savior Jesus Christ. And when justice is allowed to be his, he promises us peace, which comes through his atonement. So today's little stories They're going to include a few sections from Gonby Hinckley, Thomas S. Monson, and then we're going to hear stories of tragic events and how the individuals found it in their hearts not only to forgive, but to obtain peace. Enjoy.
In the masterfully written classic, The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas, Edmond Dantes, the protagonist, is an honest and loving man who turns bitter and vengeful after 3 covetous men bear false witness against him and frame him in a treasonous plot. When a corrupt public prosecutor becomes complicit, Dantes is arrested on the very day he is to be married to his beautiful fiancée, Mercedes. At age 19, he is given a life sentence in the infamous island prison of the Chateau d'If for a crime he did not commit. After many years of torturous years in solitary confinement, he finally meets another prisoner, the elderly Abbé Faria, who in his search for freedom has miscalculated and tunneled his way to Dante's cell rather than to an outside wall and freedom. With the tunnel now connecting their cells and nothing but time on their hands, Faria begins to teach Dante's history, science, philosophy, and languages, turning him into a well-educated man. Faria also bequeaths to Dantes a treasure of vast wealth hidden on the uninhabited island of Monte Cristo, and tells him how to find it should he ever escape. Knowing that vengeance could consume and destroy Dantes, the Abbé Faria teaches him a final lesson before he dies: to not deny the Lord's justice. Do not commit the crime for which you now serve the sentence. God said, "Vengeance is mine." "I don't believe in God," Dantes responds. "It doesn't matter, he believes in you." Dantes remains unconvinced. Upon the death of Faria, Dantes devises a clever plan by hiding himself in the death shroud of Faria, and is finally able to escape his 14 years of torment from the Chateau d'If. After securing the treasure, he becomes extremely wealthy and assumes a new identity as the Count of Monte Cristo. For the evil men who conspired against him, he devises an elaborate plan of revenge, with a painful and prolonged punishment, a just recompense for the 14 years he barely survived in the dungeon to which they unjustly sent him. With precision, Dante sets in motion his plan, and his enemies suffer the punishment which he has carefully devised for each one of them. When we read the book or watch the movie version of the Count of Monte Cristo, there is something in us that wants to see justice served against those cruel and conspiring men who inflicted so much pain on an innocent man. There is a sense of fairness and desire in each of us that good must prevail over evil, that things lost must be restored, and that broken hearts must be mended. Until these things happen, there is an injustice gap that is hard for us to reconcile in our minds, even more so in our hearts, leaving us troubled and finding it difficult to move on. People try to reconcile this injustice gap in many ways, through revenge, justifying their anger and bitterness, or seeking legal redress and imposed consequences. We ultimately discover that the Lord's way is the only way for true and complete reconciliation. The heir of Dantes was not necessarily seeking redress and justice according to the law of the land and bringing devious facts to light with appropriate penalties for the guilty, but in letting his desire for justice turn to hatred and anger, self-pity, self-justification, and other disabling behaviors on the not responsible list. He essentially descended to his enemy's level of ungodliness and used deception, lies, and fraud to entrap them, all outside the lawful process, just as they had done to him, and just as the Abbé Faria had prophesied. By relying on the law of Moses, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, rather than on the law of the gospel, including forgiving, and praying for one's enemies, Dantes imposed a life sentence of misery and bitterness on himself. In denying the Lord's justice for others, he unwittingly denied the Lord's mercy for himself and chose to serve the sentence that Christ had already served in his behalf. It robbed him of a life of happiness that could have been his but for the want of revenge. Having faith in Jesus Christ is to trust that because of his atoning sacrifice, he will correct all injustices. He will restore all things lost and mend all things broken, including hearts. He will make all things right, not leaving any detail unattended. Therefore, ye ought to say in your hearts, let God judge between me and thee, and reward thee according to thy deeds. Like Edmond Dantes, many victims have been so cruelly injured, such as in abuse cases, with no apparent justice forthcoming, that they felt like the Lord was requiring the impossible to ask them to forgive. But as hard as forgiving may be in such situations, not forgiving is even harder over the long run, because it puts a person on the disabling anti-responsibility list. Not forgiving is a synonym with blaming, anger, self-justifying, and self-pity, all things on the list. When Satan taps into any of these negative emotions, he begins exercising control over their life, even if they're right.
Recently, as I watched the news on television, I realized that many of the lead stories were similar in nature, and that the tragedies reported all basically traced back to one emotion: anger. The father of an infant had been arrested for physical abuse of the baby. It was alleged that the baby's crying had so infuriated him that he had broken one of the child's limbs and several ribs. Alarming was the report of growing gang violence, with the number of gang-related killings having risen sharply. Another story that night involved the shooting of a woman by her estranged husband, who was reportedly in a jealous rage after finding her with another man. Then, of course, there was the usual coverage of wars and conflicts throughout the world. I thought of the words of the psalmist, "Cease from anger and forsake wrath." Anger doesn't solve anything. It builds nothing, but it can destroy everything.
A time back, I clipped a column from the Deseret Morning News written by Jay Evenson. With his permission, I quote from a part of it. Wrote he, "How would you feel toward a teenager who decided to toss a 20-pound frozen turkey from a speeding car headlong into the windshield of the car you were driving? How would you feel after enduring 6 hours of surgery, using metal plates and other hardware to piece your face together, and after learning you still face years of therapy before returning to normal, and that you ought to feel lucky you didn't die or suffer permanent brain damage? And how would you feel after learning that your assailant and his buddies had the turkey in the first place because they had stolen a credit card and gone on a selfish shopping spree just for kicks? This is the kind of hideous crime that propels politicians to offices on promises of getting tough on crime. It's the kind of thing that prompts legislators to climb all over each other in a struggle to be the first to introduce a bill that would add enhanced penalties for the use of frozen fowl in the commission of a crime. The New York Times quoted the district attorney as saying, "This is the sort of crime for which victims feel no punishment is harsh enough. Death doesn't even satisfy them, he said, which is what makes what really happened so unusual. The victim, Vittorio Ruvolo, a 44-year-old former manager of a collections agency, was more interested in salvaging the life of her 19-year-old assailant, Ryan Cushing, than exacting any sort of revenge. She pestered prosecutors for information about him, his life, how he was raised, and so forth. Then she insisted on offering him a plea deal. Cushing could serve 6 months in the county jail and be on probation for 5 years if he pleaded guilty to second-degree assault. Had he been convicted of first-degree assault, the charge most fitting for the crime, he could have served 25 years in prison, finally thrown back into society as a middle-aged man with no skills or prospects. But this is only half the story. The rest of it, what happened the day this all played out in court, is the truly remarkable part. According to an account in the New York Post, Cushing carefully and tentatively made his way to where Ruvolo sat in the courtroom and tearfully whispered an apology. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you." Ruvolo then stood, and the victim and her assailant embraced, weeping. She stroked his head and patted his back as he sobbed. And witnesses, including a Times reporter, heard her say, "It's okay. I just want you to make your life the best it can be." According to accounts, hardened prosecutors and even reporters were choking back tears. What a great story that is. Greater because it actually happened, and that it happened in tough old New York. Who can feel anything but admiration for this woman who forgave the young man who might have taken her life? I know this is a delicate and sensitive thing of which I'm speaking. There are hardened criminals who may have to be locked up. There are unspeakable crimes, such as deliberate murder and rape, that justify harsh penalties. But there are some who could be saved from the long, stultifying years in prison because of an unthoughtful, foolish act. Somehow forgiveness, with love and tolerance, accomplishes miracles that can happen in no other way. The great atonement was the supreme act of forgiveness. The magnitude of that atonement is beyond our ability to completely understand. I know only that it happened, and that it was for me and for you.
Shattered parents of a 15-year-old fatally stabbed in Deer Park say they forgive his killers. Solomon Tofalanaki was on his way home from school when police allege he was targeted by boys as young as 13. Crime reporter Lana Murphy.
Paralysed by grief, a father collapses on the cold concrete where his son drew his final breath. Embraced by his wife, the broken couple struggles towards a floral memorial dedicated to the boy they will never see again. A boy robbed of his future in a shopping centre car park metres from his church.